Imagine living in a Britain where reading a newspaper was a privilege for the wealthy, not an everyday habit. This is the making of Britain, the story of how land, law and power shaped an island. In each episode, we trace a turning point that changed what Britain was and what it would become, the Britain that we know today. Information came at a cost, literally taxed by the state, to keep the majority of the population in the dark. Now imagine almost overnight those shackles falling away. The Stamp Act reforms of 1855 did exactly that. They transformed who could read, who could write, and who could shape public opinion. But they also unleashed something Britain wasn't quite ready for: scandal, sensationalism, and the beginnings of modern tabloid culture. For centuries, those in power had been wary of the printed word. Books could be censored, pamphlets could be suppressed, but newspapers, they were dangerous. They could reach too many people too quickly. Since the early 18th century, the Stamp Act had placed a tax on every copy of a newspaper, supposedly to raise revenue for the government, but really to control who could afford to read and publish them. A penny or two might not sound like much now, but it doubled the cost of a paper. For working class readers, that was prohibitive. For radical publishers, it was ruinous. Our reoccurring thread, a humble printer's apprentice, would have known this well. Apprentices worked long hours in smoky print shops, setting type by hand, ink staining their fingers as they churned out words destined only for the well-to-do. They saw the hunger amongst ordinary people for knowledge, but also the frustration. Literacy was rising, but access to cheap reading material was deliberately throttled. By the 1830s, working class radicals campaigned furiously against what they called the taxes on knowledge. Cheap, unstamped papers circulated illegally, their sellers risking prison. The authorities cracked down, raiding presses, prosecuting editors, yet the demand grew louder. Why did Britain's rulers finally give way in 1855? Was it a principled embrace of free speech or something more pragmatic? The repeal of the newspaper stamp duty in 1855 didn't come easily. Politicians feared what would happen if the mob gained unrestricted access to daily news. But by the mid-19th century, Britain was changing too fast for old controls to hold. The Industrial Revolution had created a literate working class eager for cheap reading. The railway network spread faster distribution, making daily papers viable nationwide. And campaigns led by figures like Milner Gibson and radical MPs forced the issue onto the parliamentary agenda. Eventually, Parliament caved. The Newspaper Stamp Duty Act of 1855 abolished the compulsory tax on newspapers. A year later, the advertisement duty was repealed too. The result, a flood. The price of a daily paper fell dramatically from around 5p to a penny. Overnight, the circulation boomed. Working men and even women could afford to buy a paper regularly. For the first time in history, news wasn't just for the elite, it was for everyone. The very moment that ordinary Britons gained access to a free press was also the moment that journalism itself began to change. Would it remain a serious tool of democracy, or would it be dragged down by the lure of cheap scandal? The years after 1855 saw an explosion in newspapers. Local weeklies sprang up in every town. New London dailies found audiences in the provinces. Literacy, already rising thanks to Sunday schools and mechanics institutes, now had fuel. Our printer's apprentice, now a journeyman, might have noticed the change to his workload. Where once the shop's presses worked on small runs for wealthier subscribers, now they thunder day and night for thousands of copies destined for factory workers, miners and clerks. The street corner became a place of debate as papers were read aloud to those who couldn't yet read themselves. For reformers, this was the dawn of a more democratic society. The working classes could follow parliamentary debates, scrutinise politicians and join national campaigns. Newspapers became the lifeblood of the Chartist movement, the suffrage campaigns and debates about education and empire. But again, there was a flip side, because cheaper papers needed new ways to fund themselves. Enter advertising, and with it, the temptation to prioritise circulation numbers over quality. Sensation sold, and Britain was about to discover what a free press looked like when it chased sales at any cost. By the late 19th century, the penny press had become notorious for scandal mongering. High society figures dreaded seeing their names splash across the lurid headlines. Court cases, divorces, and moral scandals became staple content. The respectable press despised this, but the public lapped it up. Papers like the Daily Telegraph gained enormous reach, while weeklies like Reynolds News sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Our printer, now a master himself, might have felt the ambivalence keenly. On the one hand, he was proud that the printed word was reaching more people than ever before. On the other, he may have wondered, was this really the knowledge that reformers had dreamed of spreading? The state, too, grew uneasy. A free press had unleashed scrutiny of government, but it had also given rise to mass market gossip, sensational crime reporting, and the rise of the modern tabloid. Britain's information age had begun, but so too had the age of scandal. And that leaves us with a provocative question. Was freeing the press the foundation of democracy, or the birth of something more chaotic, the world of the mass media we live in today? The 1855 Stamp Act reforms transformed Britain. They tore down the barriers that had kept knowledge in the hands of the few, unleashing a wave of literacy, political activism, and cultural debate. They also changed journalism itself, setting it on the path from sober reporting to sensational mass market storytelling. For our printer and for millions like him, the repeal was liberation. It meant newspapers were no longer symbols of class division, but tools of shared national life. Yet it also meant a Britain where truth and scandal competed daily for space on the front page. That's why this law matters. It didn't just change the press, it changed how Britain thought about itself and how the public sphere worked in a modern democracy. Thank you for walking a little further down the road that made Britain with me. The story winds on. Try this one. I think you'll like it. Until then, thanks so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you very soon.